I got this skirt second-hand. It is one of my favorites. Unfortunately, I've grown out of it. It has ripped. The fabric looks rather sad, as you can see. So today I'd like to show you how I'd go about replicating a beloved garment, how I'd get a pattern out of it. I have also made drafting instructions if you'd like to create a skirt like that for your own measurements and your own preferences. I will of course alter it a bit to my own, adding pockets for example in a similar fashion I did on the circle skirt. Which, by the way, if you're new here, this is a series. I'm on a mission of creating a whole wardrobe from scratch. And I keep circling back to this quote by Rick Owens, the contemporary king of all black every day. In my uniform I can go anywhere, to the opera or to a rave. This is one of the reasons I started this project. I find there is something extremely liberating in having your own personal uniform, and on a spectrum yours might be extremely colorful. But in terms of uniformity, neutral colors, and especially black, is probably one of, if not the most popular color. Apart from the versatility and practicality though, I think this is due to the symbolic layers black clothes have acquired over time. It is obviously the archetypal color of darkness and death, the void, the opposite of light. This link is inherent and will be later adopted by various rebellious and anarchistic subcultures. On the other spectrum, this melancholic connotation was also translated in the Romantic movement, the subsequent Gothic horror genre, and a bit closer to us, the similarly melancholic genre of New Wave Romantics. However, in the early Christian period, black clothes came to be a symbol for monastic virtue, mourning, a display of penitence, austerity and humility. Black garments were considered to be very dull, very lower class in fact, for the longest time, because they were never quite this brilliant black we are so familiar with today. Until the late 14th century, produced black was also not permanent and sometimes corrosive. The dyeing progress that eventually happened correlated with the demand. It was adopted by urban patricians, merchants, those in position of authority. Black quickly became a royal color, and its depth and richness was further emphasized by materials like velvet, a texture that almost swallows light completely. In Spain, the Golden Century was a great century of black. In the mid-16th century, it held the highest position. On the other hand, Reformation happened. For Martin Luther, it was the color of choice to purge men's clothes of all human vanity. But while portraits were probably the highest display of vanity and luxury, the humility aspect still works. When I look at these portraits, the black clothes push anything related to the body into the background and emphasize the person, the mind which transcends, while the body seems to be very mortal, very secondary. This translates this inherent symbolic connotation to death and void into humility in a broad sense. And well, in my opinion, the same sort of symbolism is still encoded within. The language of clothes is essentially wordless. Most of it comes to us intuitively. The black turtleneck jumper has been pretty much adopted as a symbol. It's, a sartorial signifier of the intellectual class for men and women. Now, Isaac Newton's announcement that black was no color, after all, maybe had no immediate effect on the daily life of the common man, but the sensibilities changed. Henceforth, colors became controllable and had a fixed place in the spectrum. Dyeing practices improved. Black withdrew everywhere, as much in furnishings as in dress. It comes right back to assert its dominance in men's wardrobes though, with the great masculine renunciation. As usual, I have to talk about this milestone in fashion, because not only does it change the expression of masculinity, renouncing frilliness and overt decoration, but also the display of wealth through dress. And essentially on the surface, the lines, the fabrics, the color palette becomes more somber, less flashy. On the surface, for the untrained eye, it seems much more humble, democratic even. Especially formal wear becomes uniform and black becomes the dominant color, and still is the dominant color in menswear. However, it is a very meticulously thought through dress code, and there are the tiniest of details that can only be distinguished by insiders. And this sort of perfection and simplicity of it becomes the highest manifestation of elegance and lays the foundation for our understanding of elegance today, which, similar to coolness, the display of elegance is seemingly inherent, as if one doesn't care too much about appearances at all. This is what ultimately cemented the connection of black clothes and coolness and elegance to this day, and it employs the same ideas of humility, in a broad sense, in my opinion. Now, women's fashion though, they seem to be quite the contrast in that regard for a while, still employing overt decoration. For the most part, a fully black outfit was reserved for mourning practices, most notably by Queen Victoria herself. And interestingly, women's riding gear embraced more masculine styles, those being mostly black as well. At the end of the 19th century, black became an acceptable color choice for women's evening wear. And you know, after a while, similar expressions of elegance, coolness, unbothered sophistication through black clothes were adapted in day wear as well. The little black dress being an infamous example. So again, this demonstration of humility, again, in a broad sense, or conspicuous unbotheredness, however you'd want to interpret it, is pretty much emblematic here as well. Relaxed like the boys, comme des garçons. Now, while black clothes are not always the most fashionable, they always seem to be the most elegant, because they give this sort of safe space of not taking oneself too seriously, of not seeking attention. In that sense, they also give a sort of permission. They can sort of veil, for example, eccentricity or sexuality, or even overt lacy and frilly femininity. Obviously, a lot of it has to do with styling, with the garment itself, but it's really interesting because, in my opinion, this counterbalancing austerity cannot be achieved with any other color to that same extent. And circling back to uniformity, it also allows for a sort of healthy distance, I'd argue, meaning it doesn't give away too much about one's personality. It's not as vulnerable. Maybe that's too far-fetched, but I see it similar to the way black and white photography works. Black and white photography always being slightly more sophisticated because it allows for projection, being a play of light and shadow. It gives us space for our own subjective imagination to see it in colors and context we want to. I think this is why black clothes feel so safe. I think that's why I loved this skirt so much, why it never felt out of place, never overdressed nor underdressed, depending on styling of course. And you know, the fact that you can easily restore its brilliance in the washing machine doesn't hurt either. I recommend to choose a fabric that is more on the thin, light side because of the pleats and the French seams, which you can obviously opt out of those, but there are certain areas that will be a bit bulky here. It's also better to choose something that is on a drapey side when it comes to pleats. I can imagine a nice wool here, for example, or some cotton sateen. For this project, I'd like for the skirts I make to be wearable all year round, so wool is just a bit too much, too prickly for me for the summer heat. And I've had this silk caddy lying around here. I find silk isolates great in winter and is breezy enough for summer. Now, if you have fabrics where you're not quite sure whether they are silk or not because they've been in a drawer for 10 years, a great way to test is to burn them. And you only need a few loose threads or a little piece. Silk starts to curl up very quickly and develops a bubbly black blob at the end that you can press into papery ash between your fingers. Polyester, on the other hand, gets sticky when you burn it and smells like burnt plastic, and as usual I do advise to rather stay away from those. A caddy in a broad sense belongs to the silk crepe family. The threads, they are extremely twisted and crinkly, which gives it this grainy semi-matte finish, and like most crepe fabrics it has a bit of a spring to it. In my experience it's very easy to care for, it can be washed. Pre-wash your fabric if you want to be able to wash your garment once it's finished. It's kind of fluffy on the inside but crispy to the touch, and it's also great because it doesn't wrinkle really. In fact, it doesn't really hold the fold, which means I'm going to work with reinforcement here. So you can probably figure out the pattern for a simple skirt like that without taking it apart, just by measuring the width and the pleats and a bit of geometry magic. But you know, most garments are sewn rather hastily, the seams can be a bit wonky and most materials are slinky, especially if you need a somewhat accurate measurement. And when partially closed pleats, especially several ones, come into the mixture, it can be a bit difficult to figure out the angles and stuff. So I decided to take it all apart. I wanted to get a better understanding of the curves and lines and to give you better instructions. And even if I take something like this apart, I would never just copy and paste the pieces, the panels I get, because of the wonkiness and the inaccuracies that might have had happened during the sewing process. It will be more of a guide for how the pattern is supposed to be. I start by sketching a basic grid of all the measurements I know for sure. Because there are two front panels, it's also important to figure out where the center front is. And then I also take pictures of all the details and seam allowances, everything that catches my eye really. Most of the seams here are overstitched and overlocked. The fastest way to open those, I find, is to grab the seam like that and open it like so. The zigzaggy overlocking thread will just get loose that way, and it is a lengthy, meditative endeavor, but in the end, taking a garment apart, looking at all the ingredients in an almost forced, fixated way, I think it's also great to train your understanding of patterns and sewing. When I open pleats or darts, I often sketch out, or rather mark, the seam where those were closed with a basting stitch. I don't really trust chalk here because I also have to press them open to figure out my pattern. Often you will find the actual markings for darts, for center front and stuff cut into the fabric, unbothered by time. Sometimes pleats and even darts are cut and overlocked like this. Here it's done to avoid bulk with all the overlapping, and so when you press them open you have to be gentle as to not distort or stretch out the fabric in this area. To figure out the geometry of a pattern, most of the times you'd need a line to sort of anchor it to. Because the back piece is meant to be a symmetrical panel, this would be the center back line. I pressed it, making sure that the edges are aligned. I anchor it to the edge of my paper and mark around the piece. The pleats go in a straight line, so I pierce the end through the fabric into my paper with a needle. These won't be super accurate markings, but by comparing the measurements on both sides, I round them up and I assume what they are supposed to be and correct it on my pattern. When I add a few lines in a right angle to my anchor line, I am able to find where the widest part is, how much has been taken out at the side seam, and it gives me a general idea of the relations between the pleats and the anchor line as well. I do the exact same thing with the front panel, again assuming and correcting the angles for the pleats here, and it also gives me an understanding of the relation between the front and back pieces. At this point I should also probably mention that because of the way the pockets were sewn into this skirt, it is actually meant to be worn the other way around, but I think it's silly. I've always worn it the wrong way because I like to be able to sit down comfortably. I also find it's more flattering that way, but do as you please. As expected, the main construction is made out of these 3 simple blocks, and to be completely honest, although the skirt is rather simple, I was expecting for the pattern to be a bit more complex than that. That's not how I learned to construct a pleated skirt. The hemline and the waistline are also not curved, or rather from the measurements, from what I see here, they are not. But overall, it's a pleasant surprise. Laying pleats is kind of an art in itself, and I think on this skirt they fall beautifully. So sometimes the art is in simplicity and not overthinking stuff too much. With the information I got, I made drafting instructions. I have adjusted the pattern for my actual waist measurement and the length I like. The back piece is going to be cut on fold, obviously. On the side seams there's 1.5 centimeter seam allowance because I intend to French seam this thing. A bit extra for the hemline. I mark the center back, the pleat openings and where the pockets will go, and I'll come back to these other ingredients in a bit. You can find all the details in the PDF. When I cut stuff on fold to find the end points for darts, or here for the pleat stitching, I use pins, turn the piece over and mark the points with chalk on the other side. Then I pierce another pin through this point back again, turn it over again, so that once I remove my pattern I can mark them and they are perfectly mirrored. The 2 front pieces, they are actually slightly different because you need to add a bit next to the buttonhole and a little bit more on the other side where the button will sit, so that the buttonhole opening is basically covered from underneath as well. And to finish the edges of the opening, there's also a bit of extra width that will be folded under. I place my front piece patterns right next to the selvage and cut them out. On the original skirt, this extra width, the folding under, the facing, it's reinforced on the inside, and this reinforcement, it's literally hanging by the last threads of the buttons. Flieseline like that is added where the fabric needs a bit extra strength to make certain lines a bit more crisp. And essentially it's being glued onto the fabric with heat. When you wash your garment, this adhesive can dissolve bit by bit, so technically it's dry clean only. Theoretically, you could also replace it with some sturdy fabric like linen or cotton and stitch it onto your fabric. But in general, Flieseline is just really helpful and easy to use. There are different kinds, different strengths. Some are stretchy. You will find it in most shirt colors, in waistbands, but also on little spots next to cuts and things to prevent fraying. However, there they are sort of enclosed by fabric, by stitching, and don't get loose, don't move around, which is not the case on this skirt. I've made a few experiments, and like I said, my fabric doesn't hold a fold that well, and since it's especially helpful with buttonholes, which there's going to be a lot of those, I'm going to use reinforcement, but I'm going to be a bit more provident. First, I glue my flieseline to the wrong side of the fabric, right next to the selvage. This one is medium strong, non-stretchy, and pre-cut precisely to the width I need. And now I'm going to additionally stitch it right along here. I think this will also help for the edge to fold and stay rather sharp. The selvage can be pressed onto it, and I'll stitch it on as well. And this is to eliminate any extra steps, overlocking, and make the inside a bit more neat. So there will be no stitching lines on the outside, this will be on the inside, and the flieseline, it'll also know its place. I have also added some reinforcement for the hemline, but in the end it was kind of unnecessary, you'll see in a bit. With that out of the way, let's close the pleats. You can adjust and make them wider if you want. These are quite deep already, which I love, and they are also slightly angled to emphasize the waist. The great thing about pleats is that you can open them or pinch them more if your waist measurement changes. This is a nice way to prolong the life of a garment. Don't be fooled by me though, you'd have to open up a few seams, which but this fabric is pricey, and I'd like to make it as easy as possible for future Katerina. I pierce a needle through both markings and wiggle it a bit. Then I put the top markings onto each other, pin those, and just sew in a straight line. Ideally, you also shouldn't sew over needles, don't take me as an example here. The end of the seam I close with the machine by going back and forth a few times. I do not recommend to close darts that way, but since there's going to be a bit of tension here and there are seams that don't sit directly on the skin, that are a bit hidden, I think this will be best. On the original skirt, most of the seams, and these ones, they were overstitched as well. I actually prefer a cleaner look, and like I said, I want to have the option of opening this up again, which this is one less seam to open. So I just press my pleats. They are all meant to be pressed toward the center, so toward center front and center back. On the original, the widest pleat was also cut back and overlocked because it kind of overlaps here and it creates a bit of bulk, but I think this will be fine, and again, I'd like to be able to open it if needed. As usual, if you're intimidated by pockets, just shut your side seams close and skip them altogether. I like for my pockets to be very big, sturdy and neat on the inside, especially since I'm not going to line the skirt and I'm going to work with French seams here. Because of all these layers, I'm just using a lightweight cotton for the pouch, and I made an additional PDF on how to construct pockets for French seams. These drafting instructions will work for any skirt. You'd need your front panel as a base. In this example for construction, you'd need to close the pleats like so and work from there. So this is the pouch, it is cut on fold. This is my front and this is my back piece. There's 1.5 centimeter seam allowance here. I'll make the markings for the pocket opening a bit more noticeable. The right sides are facing me, and I make an additional mark 1 centimeter lower on each side. We'll need those later. This is the inside of the pouch, and I'm going to connect it to the skirt pieces very counterintuitively, wrong sides together first. I'm going to stitch this first seam down up to the marking with a 0.5 seam allowance. When I place my needle to the right, I can use the edge of my machine's foot as orientation. It's exactly 5 millimeters. I have to cut back some of this fluff here first. And now I can turn it over and press the seam slightly with my fingers. I will stitch again right up to the marking, but this time it will be 1 centimeter seam allowance, so I place my needle to the far left. And that's basically a French seam. The raw edges are sort of sandwiched together on the wrong side. I can do the same thing on the actual side seam, pinching the pouch out of the way for now. And I will stitch from the second marking, that's 1 centimeter lower, down to the bottom, again with 0.5 centimeter seam allowance, like that. And I turn it over again, press the seam with my fingers. If you're extra neat, you can also press it for real, obviously. And it is important to pull out the pouch and really pinch the seam allowance of the pouch to the outside, out of the way, because the stitch needs to start directly where we left off and go down to the hem. So so this seam really needs to continue for it to look neat. If it gets too tricky for your machine, it might also be easier to not cut the threads and just close this last little bit here by hand. The pouch is still open here. I turn it inside out so the inside is facing me, and it's also going to be French seamed. This time I pinch the skirt out of the way and I get the seam allowances out here as well. I stitch along this edge with 0.5 seam allowance, again turn it inside out, press the seam with my fingers. It's much easier with cotton actually. And so this is why we left this 1 centimeter open here, because now the seam allowance of the pouch can be sort of pushed in there. And this seam, it will go like a regular French seam with 1 centimeter seam allowance, but here we're also going to go down for a bit to secure it. And now would also be the time to add understitching to the side of the pocket that will curl inward with the front, but that's actually a thing I prefer to do by hand, and I'll come back to that in a bit. But because it is a fitted skirt, it is fitted at the waist, the top needs to be secured, otherwise the pockets will just be stretched open all the time. First I press these seams, the seam allowance lies toward the pocket on both sides. I will baste these together, the length should be roughly the same as the length of your pleats. While basting I feel with my fingers where the edge starts on the other sides that I can't see. And I stitch very close to the initial seam, maybe 1 millimeter inward. The pocket is closed from both sides and I'm going to press it. It's pretty straightforward, the seam allowances need to be pressed toward the front. Both these points at the opening are stress points, and now that the seam allowance is pressed, I can secure these opening points with an additional zigzag stitch. I will also add a stitch here along the edge on the front side so that the lining of the pocket slightly curves inward, and apparently it's called a prick stitch, so thank you for that. It's really hard sometimes to find translations for these kind of things. You can understitch it here, so essentially stitch the pouch onto the seam allowance. It looks very neat as well. I personally really like this sort of hand-sewn details. There are obviously 1,000 ways to insert a pocket. With this method it looks pretty neat, but because there are essentially 2 French seams sitting on top of each other, I wouldn't recommend it for heavy, thick fabrics, but then again you wouldn't necessarily use French seams with those anyway. And these are the finished pockets. The bottom is free to move and the weight will be secured in the waistband as well. But before we start with that, well, the thing is, I still don't know how to properly call these. If you have suggested these to be suspenders, they are kind of like straps. They will pull up the skirt a bit, but they don't necessarily hold it. To me, it's more of a design choice rather than a technical attribute, meaning you can skip the straps altogether. You can also make them detachable with buttons, for example. However, they really do add to the silhouette of the skirt, even if they are worn down like that. I like the shape it creates. It gives just a bit more texture and styling options, so I'm going to replicate them in the exact same way. In the PDF you will find the width and length of the original ones, but obviously each one of us has a slightly different torso. We are all a bit asymmetrical as well. So before you cut and attach, I suggest you make a mock-up or just make them slightly longer first and adjust later, because, and I'm sure you will agree, there's nothing more annoying than shoulder straps that fall down constantly. So on the original there are 2 strips that are attached to each other. One of them is reinforced with flizzoline, so I did that. They are sewn together along the edges, wrong sides together, and I'm definitely using the reinforced side as orientation. Like I said, this fabric is rather slinky and cutting a straight line was a bit difficult. Now to make these edges as crisp as possible, I'm going to press the seam open, and I use a wooden spoon to help with that. Then I press them flat. I've been thinking of overstitching the edges like they did on the original, but I think it'll be fine like that actually. Like the originals though, the ends that are going to be connected to the back are cut at an angle. I marked it here with pins, but it's the reinforced side that will be on the inside, on the body. And these 2 will also overlap at center back. At the front they are supposed to end in a straight line, right next to this outer pleat here. I will baste it, wear it for a bit and adjust if needed. And I actually had to adjust slightly. This is the sort of weird part of sewing when you notice all the asymmetries about yourself. I have secured them to the front here. For the next step, I will also add another loose stitch all around the top with my seam allowance, just to make sure that the pockets and seam allowances lie toward the front and all the pleats are really secure in there. And I also check and pull on this thread in a few areas where my fabric might have stretched out a bit during the process. I will leave these ends unfinished. I'm using zigzag shears here. They'll be fine, but you can obviously overlock or zigzag stitch them as well. The original skirt had an interfacing in the waist area. It was 8 cm long, reinforced and overlocked. And you can simply draft it by folding the pleats on your paper pattern, mark 8 cm all around and connect those to each other. Because this is such a bulky business here, and just because I think it looks prettier, I'm going to use a ribs ribbon. Maybe it's also called a gross grain ribbon in English. This one is 4 cm wide, it's made out of cotton, and I cut it exactly to the waist measurement plus the extra for the buttons. I mark the middle here and I press into a slightly rounded shape. This actually brings back memories. I used to work with these every single day during my time in the millinery. Now this side will be slightly longer, as you can see. Another important preparation to make sure that this waistline, all of these pleats, seam allowances are as flat as possible to minimize the thickness here. I'm going to take some time. First I press it with steam and then I left my iron rest on it. The heat will help the moisture to evaporate, and then I quickly put something heavy on it and let it rest and cool. Let me mark the center back here again. The right side of the skirt is facing me. The thingies are pointing down. The right side, I mean in terms of the markings I made here, because the right side is a bit longer, the right side of the ribbon is facing me, and I placed the narrower side right onto the stitch we made earlier. And I will baste it first. I started at the center to make sure that the tension is evenly distributed. And now I can stitch it on right along the edge of the ribbon up until the edges of the skirt. These ribbons are fairly strong. They will hold this tension really well. I also think they give a historical, pretty look on the inside. You probably know by now that I'm obsessed with that. But the main reason I prefer this method here is because with an interfacing you would add unnecessary bulk with additional seam allowances of an interfacing. Another bonus, just for longevity's sake, it will be relatively easy to remove and add a bit of waistband insert if I should need to open up some pleats and readjust my waist measurement in the future. These overlappings can be folded over the waistband, and I will secure them as well using the back side for orientation, like that. It can be turned over now, and I will press this ribbon down. I will additionally secure it very sneakily in the side seam here. I'm stitching it from the right side, and it's just additional help for the ribbon to stay folded under. This I will leave open. In my experience it will be totally fine. You can however add a slip stitch along this edge if that bothers you. The ribbon will be also secured with a buttonhole and a button here. I actually don't mind the way they finished the hem on the original. It's folded under and overstitched, and initially that's what I wanted to do. That's why I reinforced it here. But to be honest, I'm so pleased with how the waistband turned out, and the French seams, they are quite thick, especially if you consider that I would need to fold them over each other twice. I have also stitched the reinforcement here along the edge. The fabric will definitely show the hem. It's quite thin, but again, with the French seams it won't be possible to make a super thin baby hem here either, so I'm going to use the ribbon again. But I'm also going to top stitch it. Okay, so I'm basting it on top along the stitching. By the way, this is something I've seen done on tailored trousers, on the hems of tailored trousers. I'm going to cut this back. If I fold it up here at the front edges, I'd like to finish it with a, in German it's called a letter corner, Briefecke, basically a diagonal stitch that will connect side and bottom here. I mark on each side where the edges meet, and I place these markings onto each other and will stitch diagonally into the corner here. Now I will cut it back and turn it over. For the ribbon, I secured it with a slip stitch, something I talked about in a previous video. This type of handwork gets better with practice. I tried my best at setting the stitches evenly and fairly close as well, and also to not apply too much tension. I'm actually somewhat disappointed because this fabric is so thin, the stitching is noticeable, especially in movement. But from experience, I know it will settle a bit better after a few washes and pressing. I love though how it looks on the inside, but maybe next time when I work with this fabric, I'll find a different way. First of all, I will add the markings, and the buttons as well as the edges of the buttonholes need to sit directly at center front. The top 3 ones are slightly closer together, and I make 6 in total. If you have a normal sewing machine, most likely you will have a foot attachment and you can just make them quickly with the machine. I don't have one of these, and I'm also a bit ambitious about getting better at stitching them by hand. And you know, someday I just might. I'm using buttons that are covered in the same fabric as usual. I already professed my love for those in a previous video, but I'd also like to mention I'm not doing them myself. I get them done here locally. You can certainly get these kind of sets, but in my experience these sort of buttons always turn out to be kind of flimsy. In university we had one of these special press tools. They make very neat and sturdy buttons. Now I don't really have access to one of these anymore, but here's a shop locally where you would bring your fabric and choose the size you need, and they'll make the buttons for you, but you can obviously use any buttons you like. I hope this inspires you to try it out. I do intend to wash it in the washing machine on a gentle setting, hopefully not too often. Crepe fabrics do not demand too much care. It barely wrinkles, for example. It's very flowy. I really like that the silk doesn't attract lint as readily, or actually not at all as far as I can tell. However, in general, for lint I recommend the physical brushes rather than the adhesive ones, because those can damage your fabric in the long run. I'm going to make a drapey wrap skirt next. Bye!